ki Adonai Mitzion in Malkoch in Ba Madu Apisuri Vislayem Avlichor Arkatzir Kolokayit Lanach Ulon Noshanim Al Shemer Basami Hashmarti Padarti Shama Hafzikasi Hatzari Gilon Imrofa Shaki Madua also Arutas Basami Mitai Roshimai Reni Kortima Rekayam Hamalayla Salai Basami Pinei Namidor Malone Orpheus Basami Velchamita Kipula Nafi Asheres Obi That light of Shana Kashtom Shaker Lolando Lord Inera El Ra'ayatu Vasila Yadu Numadunoi Ishmereyu Ishameyu Yalkolo Chaltitabu Ifala Tako Yako Horeya Rafil Yako Ishmereyu Yaseyu Yanes Lo Yitakeru Lindu Shana Dar Sheker Avedu Shikutah Sofirma Ve'ajudaso Si Adonai Lafei Tomar Adonai Tzos Inani Tzorfo Ulchati Asem Nei Vasami Eit Shofu L'Shona Min Madiveh B'fim Shalom Esve'eyu Yidaber Kibo Yosim Arbo A'ilah Padbo Nimadunoi In Goy Asher Chazeh Lo Sisnafei Nafshi Al Hehori Naso B'fivatei V'alos Midbar Kino Kinitzu V'yishover V'lo Shamu Kol Bikneh Me'ova Shomayim Yadehima Nadedu Allah V'nasati Es Yerushalayim V'galim Tzadim V'yasarei Yudah Et Shmama V'Yoshei V'yishech Acham V'yoven Etzos Asher Diber Yadonai Elo Yagidah Alma Dahoret Itzasa Akbar V'yover V'yomer Adonai Alazma Misto Nosi Asher Nosati B'neihem Lo Shamu V'koli Lo Halkuva V'yelethu Acharei Shuslipa Me'alavim Asher Kulavusa L'chei Tomar Adonai Tzos Elohei Yisrael Hineni Ma'achilam Esazel Lahana Yishkisi Meirosh V'avitzasi Ma'avi Asher Lo Yadu Hei Mo'avusa V'shilach V'yacharei Esacheret Adkosi Uso Omar Adonai Tzos Yitzvonu V'kirun Kodenos Usoeno V'choshefu V'savona V'smerno V'sishalei V'nei V'seyad Noinei V'tima V'yafavei V'mayim Ki Kol Mehi Shvan Tzion Eich Shudad Rosh Liyot Yatzad Oret Kishlifu Vishnaseinu, Kishanan Anoshim Dilaradunoi, Nisitachas Lechem Darki, Vilaneinam No Seichem Nehi, Bishar Soch Kino, Ki Alam Oves V'chalam Neinu, Bar Noseinu, Lachri Sodom Yichut, Lachri Nerfovot, Daber, Kol Nimradonai, V'naflon Yimlasvadom, Gidom Ben Apneas Hater, V'chanim Yacharei Koter, Ve'im Ma'aser Nivko, Amar Adonai, Al Yisrael Chacham V'chachmaso, Al Yisrael Gibor, Guraso, Al Yisrael Ashir, V'yashra, V'yim V'zos, Yisrael, Yisrael, Askel, Yosi, Yeri Adonai, Yosef Chesed, Mishpat Tzedakah, Haaretz, Ye'elech Chafatzti, Adonai. Amen. Amen. Which one is Facebook? Which one is YouTube? So this is already running? Or this is it's running. Okay.
You need a cable. I'll find you a cable. It's okay. Just we'll never. Just we'll go live now.
Did you bring the thing for it? No, I'm saying the thing to prop it up.
I sent a prop up right here.
Okay, fine.
I gave you that.
Acho que melhor ligar para dentro do aparecimento que cada.
Here, I'll take it now.
Yeah, just it's this button here. this is live. 78.
Okay, check that. Sorry, no.
So like tipping instruments while I'm staring at myself.
What?
So I'm doing tipping instruments while I'm staring at myself.
Wrong one.
You know it's still running.
Yes, as long as that little green light is on.
Everyone should have a copy of one of the Kinos books. I think there's still a few copies in back. There are also sheets available that have the schedule of which 18 Kinos we are going to attempt to get through together this morning. So about 6 months ago, I was at a conference for Rabbanim in Florida. This is an annual group that is convened by my teacher, Rabbi Dr. J.J. Schachter, who's also speaking about Kinos as we speak. And there was a session devoted to the topic of how rabbis deal with trauma in their congregations. As at a certain level, first-line responders, how does that affect the inner life of Rabbanim? So 2 rabbis gave presentations, and I'd like to start with something that I heard this morning. So it was a story of a young rabbi who had a pulpit, and weeks before he went to shul, he had been in a crisis, that a young man grew up in the community, part parcel of the community, young people in the community who had been learning in yeshiva in Israel, was caught in a terrorist attack. Was in a van of young men. Terrorists shot at the van, and this boy Nebuch, this rabbi, came into this community that is trying to figure out how to deal with that a beloved young person lost in such a horrible, tragic. So in describing what was going on in this community, was that following the attack, the teen minyan in the shul almost collapsed. That there was a sense, none of the teenagers who had been until then regular attendees of this minyan run by kids for the kids, a difficulty, a resistance, almost a brick wall of that the idea that after an event like this took place, that someone who he went to yeshiva, he went to learn, suddenly, in a seemingly senseless, random act of violence, loses his life. There was a certain sense of rejection, of like, what is this all about? And how is it possible for us to talk to God if this is the world that he runs? So I thought this was very much a Tisha B'Av idea. Because one of the difficult themes that we struggle with on Tisha B'Av is the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu rejecting our prayers. And the sense that it wasn't just years following the destruction of the temple, something that Klal Yisrael as a whole felt, that our tefillos, that our davening is just not going to be answered. And this is actually reflected on a certain level in the halacha and the customs of Tisha B'Av. So I'm sure people are aware this morning, as part of davening, we omitted the recitation of Tachanun. Now, Tachanun, normally, we think of as a sad kind of prayer. Right? And in fact, normally on occasions of joy, on a yantif, of something of that sort, it's not a day for saying Tachanun. Right? Tachanun is a sad kind of idea. And the truth is certainly every other fast day that cycles during the year, we say Tachanun on some Gedalia, on Asar B'Teves, on Shabbat. Tisha B'Av, we don't say Tachanun. So there are two explanations for this phenomenon. One, which is the most famous and which really deserves treatment of its own because it's a very difficult to understand concept, is the idea that in Eicha, that we refer to Tisha B'Av, or the time of the destruction of the temple, as a moed, as really the same word that we use for festival. So there's an idea that we find in the Rishonim that since Tisha B'Av is called a moed, on a moed you don't say Tachanun. Now that is a very challenging concept in its own right? What kind of a holiday is this? Right? This is the saddest day of the whole year, right? So therefore, we're going to leave out our sad tefillos. So again, there's much to be said on the concept of Tisha B'Av as a moed, perhaps for another year. Beis Yosef, though, quotes another explanation for this practice. And he quotes based on two verses that we find in the book of Eicha, in the 3rd chapter of Eicha. So we read, Sakosa ve'anan lach me'avor tefillah. So the pasuk says that God has wrapped himself in a cloud not to allow prayer to penetrate. That God has blocked off prayer. In fact, there's a Gemara in Brachos that says, Yom Shecharav Beis Hamikdash, from the day the temple was destroyed, that an iron curtain, right, 1900 years before Churchill said it, right, the Gemara says that an iron curtain separates between the Jewish people and their Father in heaven. Right, that there's a sense that part of Churban is the sense that God does not want to hear from us. He's not interested in our prayers, and that our prayers are not going to work. Now, on one level, this notion is essentially heretical. Right? The idea that this is bedrock to Yiddishkeit. The idea that God is there and he's listening to our prayers. How he processes them is a different story. Right? But it is undeniable that on an emotional level, this is part of the reaction that we have to Churban, to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, as well as to other forms of destruction. So it's interesting, we have in general this ambivalent relationship to davening on Tisha B'Av. On the one hand, we do what we need to do. Right? We have the 3 regular tefillos, we're not exempt from them. But at the same time, there's this idea this is not fundamentally a day for prayer. And it's interesting, all of the customs that developed about not wearing talis and tefillin, the idea that we're like kind of dragging ourselves here this morning. You know, it's interesting, there's a custom among some Syrian Jews that on Tisha B'Av, that they hold, according to some opinions, that really you should put on tefillin on the morning of Tisha B'Av. So what they do is that they all put on talis and tefillin at home. They daven shacharis, and then they take off their talis and tefillin and they come to shul for later. So de facto, davening is canceled. You daven quietly, modestly, humbly in your home, right? But as far as shul is concerned, something's off. Something's very much off. There's an old minhag that's recorded in Masechah Sofrim, it's quoted by later sources as well, that the person who gets an aliyah on Tisha B'Av, before they make the brachos on the Torah, they make the bracha Baruch Dayan HaEmes. In other words, it doesn't feel right. It's off. So it's interesting. There was a period of time where in Bavel and Babylonia, in the time of the Gaonim, some 1,200 years ago, the Jews said slichos on Tisha B'Av. Right? If you think about it, I might have said this is a day we're talking about how to process the fact that God has punished the Jewish people. Should ask for forgiveness, right? So the whole structure of slichos, and in certain ways this may just sound like semantics, right? That many of the Kinos that we're going to read this morning, right, they're liturgical poetry. If I handed you a Kina and I handed you some of the slichos that we're going to say Rosh Hashanah and Kippur time, it's not going to look very different, right? There's the text of it. One is called the Kina, one is called the Slicha, but there's something very important that's different. That slichos, when we say slichos, the point of each of the poetic pieces that we say, right, is to be a lead up to saying the Shlosh Esrei Midos Shel Rachamim, to say, invoking the 13 attributes of divine mercy. Right? So we have a tradition that in the aftermath of the sin of the golden calf, Moshe asks God, how do we do tshuva? And he says, I'm going to teach you a formula. And the Gemara says that if we didn't have a tradition like this from the Pasuk, we wouldn't be able to say it. That God put on a talus like a chazan, and he showed Moshe Rabbeinu how to say the Yud Gimel Midos Sorach, how to invoke the attributes of God's mercy. And that's what we do. Right? The whole season of Slichos, it's all, over the centuries, various Paitanim, various poets wrote their inspired creations, right? To kind of get us into the mood to talk about the various themes of the season, the various reasons why we're hoping Hashem will forgiveness, the merit of Avraham and Yitzchak, right? Everything like that. But the point of it, right, that each slicha is a lead up to the main event, which is Hashem Kel Rachum L'Chanun, is asking God for mercy. The way that the Psak works out, we don't say slichos on Tisha B'Av. That on Tisha B'Av, we say, essentially, we use all the same, similar kind of poetry, right? We connect to the themes of the day, but we never deliver on Hashem Kel Rachum L'Chanun. That on Tisha B'Av itself, we're not even asking for mercy, right? We're not invoking that magic formula that was given to the Jewish people for forgiveness. And this is the day that we feel sasam tefillah, that our prayer has been locked out. So I noticed this year that the two key psukim in Eicha that give this painful theological message of rejection are both from the 3rd chapter of Eicha. Right? We read Gam ki ezak va'ashavea, that even when I scream out sasam tefilasi, that my prayer has been closed up. And then later, the pasuk that I mentioned before that we'll see is part of the first line of the beginning of our Kina, Sakosa ve'ananlach me'avor tefillah, that you have wrapped yourself in the cloud so that the prayer cannot penetrate. Right? Again, I think it's worth noting here that the word Sakosa is the same word as sukkah. Right? It's the same origin, that you've sheltered yourself, you've insulated yourself. Right, and very suggestively, sakosa va'anan, that you've closed yourself off with a cloud. Right, so the whole idea of sukkahs, right, and it's interesting, sukkahs is very intimately connected to the Beis Hamikdash. The whole idea of sukkahs, right, is that's the anani hakavod, right? It's God's glory is sheltering us and protecting us and embracing us, right? And now, in a ironic, really painful kind of inversion, instead of the cloud being a symbol of God being with us, it's a symbol of how God is disconnected from us at this time, right? It's a inversion of the holiday of Sukkot. So this chapter, the 3rd chapter of Eicha, is a little bit unusual. It is unusual. It is profoundly in first person. Right? It is written from the perspective of a single person talking about their experience of the Korban. So the question is, who's the person? Right? Who is this who is the narrator of this chapter. So Rashi and Ibn Ezra at the beginning of the 3rd chapter both agree that these are the words of the prophet Yirmiyahu. Right? This is Jeremiah himself, the man who, more than anyone else, is associated with events of the destruction of the first temple. And then when he goes through this chapter and talks about it, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has led me and brought me into darkness. He has turned against me. He has built a mound against me. He stops up my prayer. He encloses my way with hewn stone. Right? That Yirmiyahu is internalizing both his own experience as well as the experience of the Jewish people as a whole. Right? And that's where we find this idea, where we have focused, right, on the experience of the individual, that you're talking about the feeling of rejection. So Yirmiyahu had perhaps the most difficult life of any of our prophets. He had a mission that he had no interest in carrying out, that only through the force of God's will did he accept his calling. And his calling essentially was for 4 decades to tell the Jewish people, you're going to be defeated, you're going to be destroyed, everything that you're planning, all of the politics that you're doing, the alliances to try to protect yourself, they're going to come to nothing. The temple ground. And he received a very, very cold response to his prophecies. He was attacked, he was beaten, he was thrown in a pit. He was rejected. He was called a false prophet. And it's not that, like, this was not Yirmiyahu's agenda, right? Yirmiyahu wanted the privilege of saying prophecies of redemption. You read in this chapter of Eicha how painful this all was for him. So there's a story in the 37th chapter of Yirmiyahu. There's a new king, the last king that would rule from the house of David. His name was Tzidkiyahu. And he was a good man. He was a weak man, but he was a good man. So it says Tzidkiyahu sends a delegation to the prophet Yirmiyahu, who is in prison. He sends a delegation of 2 people, Yehuchal ben Shelemiah and Sephanyahu ben Maaseiah. So I mention this because it's just a kind of a remarkable thing. But 10 years ago, in the area of what's called Ir David. Right? Ir David is the area, some of you, we're going to go to Eretz Yisrael together in the fall, and we'll see some of this ourselves. But Ir David, outside of the Har HaBayis of the Temple Mount, it goes down, a lot of it is an Arab village called Silwan today. Right? In Ir David, they find incredible things on a regular basis. So they found a little clay seal in Ir David, and on the clay seal is the name Yehuchal ben Shelemiah. In other words, the person that Tzidkiyahu sends to Yirmiyahu on a mission, right? We now have his seal, right? 2,500 years from the kever, from, we don't know, he may have been quite likely one of the people who died in the siege of Yerushalayim, but we still have his seal 2,500 years later. So what's the message they give to Yirmiyahu? Hispalel na ba'adenu el Hashem Elokeinu. Pray for us, right? We know maybe you can pray for us. And I think those are the experiences that are being channeled in the 3rd parak of Eicha, Asasam Tfilas. How much time did Yirmiyahu stuck in the pit, davening for Yerushalayim, davening for the Beis HaMikdash? And at the end of the day, and this is the people, even, the king, even when politically he couldn't express it publicly, he says, maybe you're you're our Baal Tefillah, right? You're the chazan for the Jewish people. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So the truth is that this is not only about Tisha B'Av itself. It's a more existential kind of question. It's interesting, there's a Gemara in Yuma that points out that Moshe Rabbeinu came up with the idea of approaching God in prayer with the words, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vanora. God who is great, right? God who is powerful, who's awesome. And he says that Yirmiyahu took the word awesome out of that phrase. He said, how can we say it? Nachrim mekarkarin behechalo ayeno osav. He says, when our enemies are dancing around the ruins of the temple, how can we say that God's awesome? So it's not just that God doesn't answer us. It's the idea that we can't bring ourselves to even come to that place. How do you say God is awesome when you're watching people dancing around the ruins of the Beis HaMikdash? It doesn't go. It doesn't go. So it's interesting. Rav Soloveitchik says, the truth is this is something that repeats itself in our lives as well. Now, we have a very unusual halacha called aninos. So many of you have experienced this, that God forbid, after the loss of a close relative, the time until the funeral has its own distinct set of laws. And it's not exactly the same as Shiva. Certain things that are allowed during Shiva are forbidden during Aninos. Right? So for instance, during Shiva, you're allowed to eat meat and drink wine. During Aninos, you're not allowed to eat meat and drink wine. So one of these restrictions of Aninos is you're not allowed to daven. You're not allowed to daven, you're not allowed to make brachos. Right? When someone is, again, in that period between when you lose your relative and when the relative is buried. Right? That's the time of Aninos. There is no davening during that time. So generally, we assume that the reason for Aninos is that Aninos represents a time where our obligation to see to the needs of our deceased relative overwhelms any other obligation in halakha. Perhaps an extension of the idea that someone involved in a mitzvah is exempt from other mitzvahs. But the Rav explained this in existential terms. He said that the reality is that in the moment after we lose someone, that we're not ready to talk to God, right? That there is a period of time, right, where you have to take a break, where you have to say, look, I feel worthless, right? I feel I have had this brush with mortality, right? I know that we're all going to die in the end, right? And what kind of standing do I have to talk to God, right? And perhaps to take it a step further, maybe I don't want to talk to God right now. Maybe I don't feel them. So he says halacha creates what I would call like a timeout, right? Where again, you have to focus on the kfura, on the burial, that's for sure. But in addition to that, there has to be, as it were, a space from God. I want to read you a brief passage here that he wrote. He says, before burial in the state of Aninos, man mourned in total darkness and confusion. And his grief expressed itself in an act of resignation from his greatness and chosenness. That's Tisha. That's Tisha B'Av. That's when you come up to the Torah, right? And before you make the bracha, you have to say Baruch Dainanos. Right? There's the idea that the regular narrative can work for you. It's not there. And he says that this changes for us when we say Kaddish at burial. He says, the truth is, if you ever read Kaddish, there's very little. So this is something which is heroic. He says, through the Kaddish, we hurl defiance at death and its fiendish conspiracy against man. When the mourner recites, glorified and sanctified be the great name, he declares, no matter how powerful death is, notwithstanding the ugly end of man, however terrifying the grave is, no matter how black one's despair is, we declare and profess publicly and solemnly that we are not giving up, that we are not surrendering. We will carry on the work of our ancestors as though nothing has happened. So the morning of Tisha B'Av, we're holding before Kaddish. Right? Later, and this may be tied up to a somewhat different character of Mincha and Tisha B'Av afternoon. Right now, we're not asking for anything. We're not asking for forgiveness. We're not praying for our health. Right now, we are trying to connect to the mindset of that intense kind of suffering, to channel as it were, the world of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, right? That place that even when they're begging you to daven, doesn't go. So before we go to the Kinos, I just want to end with a thought I think I've shared in the past, but I think it's very pertinent to this idea. The Gemara tells us there was a sage in Yerushalayim named Rabbi Tzadok. So Rabbi Tzadok, the Gemara says, fasted for 40 years that the Beis HaMikdash not be destroyed. Right? That he ate a very little amount in the evenings, but basically put himself through a terribly rigorous regimen of fasting. And in fact, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who we'll come back to later, who later escapes from Yerushalayim during the siege in the Second Temple, right, and is able to secure certain favors to allow the continuation of the Jewish people, one of the people that he appeals to save is that Tzadok should be taken out of Yerushalayim. They should bring doctors to help nurse him back to health. He was so emaciated from all of those years of fasting. Best medical care. So Shlomo Radomsker, one of the great Hasidic teachers of 19th century Poland, says, what a failure. 40 years he fasted, gave up his whole life, and didn't succeed. The Beis HaMikdash is burned to the ground. And you would imagine, if I was Reb Tzadok, and the Roman doctors are putting their IVs in me to nurse me back to health, all I can think about is how badly I failed. So he says that we are looking at it incorrectly. He says the truth is Rabbi Tzadok saved Yerushalayim for 40 years. That if not for his efforts, if not for his prayers, if not for his fasting, it could have been 40 years there was no Beis HaMikdash. It's a whole generation of people who were able to go, who were able to connect. 40 years the Jews came for Pesach and were able to sit together with their families, eating the Karban Pesach, singing Hallel. 40 times the Kohen Gadol would go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to find expiation for the Jewish people on Yom Kippur. And he says it's all due to Reb Tzadok. So he says that you have to learn a certain derech avodah, a certain kind of formula of serving God. It's true there are times where we as individuals, we as communities, where we as a nation suffer tremendous crises. Right? And we feel like God's not listening to our prayers. But he says, the bottom line is Shebechol Yom Yispalel Ha'adam Lihinatzel Hayom. Every day you should daven that you should be saved for today. And to realize that even in the moments that we feel rejected, that we don't understand the mechanisms by which our prayer works. And we hope that even when it doesn't feel that way, that there is an impact that is being had by our prayers that perhaps we will never totally understand in this world and in our lifetimes. So we'll start with the first Kina of Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, the Kina where he says in the very beginning, he references this idea of the blocking of prayer at page 91 in the small black Rosenfeld Kinos, page 152 in the art scroll. I will just remind you, there are 2 editions of the art scroll. In some of them, the pagination is slightly different than the others. Shavas. The next kina, Eicha Yashua Chavatzel Sasharon, is a kina, another of the kinos of the great poet Rebbe Elazar Kalir, and it is a piyut which focuses specifically and is structured around the Mishmaros HaKahuna. So the Kohanim, the families of the Kohanim, were divided into 24 clans, and that there is a cycle. There's a rotation of which clans at which time. That essentially you would have 2 weeks out of the year that your mishmar, that your group would be on, would have the privilege of being involved in the workings of the Beis Hamikdash, the bringing of the korbanos, and then on Yantiv, on Pesach, and on Sukkot and Shavuos, it would be all hands on deck. Any Kohanim, there were so many Jews that had to be processed and dealt with their korbanos, that you had a tremendous influx of Kohanim to Yerushalayim during those weeks. So the structure of this piyut is that it uses as a chorus, as it were, right, the different families of the Kohanim. Right, the idea that at the end of each stanza, it evokes the name, perhaps the memory of one of these otherwise lost families of Kohanim. So in previous years, we have talked about the startling reality that we have evidence for a good 1,000 years after the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, that these families retain their identities. They remember, not only they remember, but that there's archaeological evidence of shuls that were built in the centuries after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash in Eretz Israel, in Yemen, and other places, that actually had the list of the families of the Kohanim written up on the walls, and that there's evidence in the Cairo that they even would announce in shul, this Shabbos is the Shabbos of family X, Meheira Yibani HaMikdash, hopefully the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt, and they should have the opportunity to serve again, right? Which again, really blew my mind when I first saw this material, understanding how long, desperately, right, with no Beis Hamikdash, Jews tried to hold on to this idea, right? And that's part of the context that the Kalir is coming from when he writes his kina. But more globally, that this is a kina for the kahuna. It is a way that we are mourning a lost institution, which again exists only in a very shattered kind of form, but an institution which certainly was central to the Torah's vision of the Jewish people. There should be a certain culture of noblesse oblige that exists in these families, that the Kohanim are there to serve the Jewish people and to serve God. We don't have that. Again, in a very, very attenuated kind of form. So I want to take you to the last days of the Beis Hamikdash. to what it was like to be a Kohen in Yerushalayim under siege. So 3 weeks ago, we observed Shavas B'Tammuz. While the Mishnah says that 5 terrible things occurred in Shavas B'Tammuz, I think the one that we are most familiar with is Hufka Ha'ir, that it was a significant stage in the demolishing of the walls of Jerusalem and the abilities of the Romans to come in towards the area of the Temple Mount, and that is kind of front and center of Shavas B'Tammuz. But there is another event that happened on Shavas B'Tammuz, we mentioned in the Mishnah, called Butal HaTamid, that was the day that the Karban Tamid, that the daily offering of the Beis HaMikdash was not given. So we have a very detailed record of the events of the destruction, very valuable, also very compromised, in the works of Josephus Flavius. So Josephus Flavius was a Jew, in fact he was a Kohen. His name before he got all fancy in Latin and became Josephus Flavius was Yosef ben Matisyahu Kohen. And he was a general of the Jews during the revolt against the Romans. And then he turns traitor. He goes over to the Roman side. He becomes kind of an adopted member of the families of the emperor that will destroy the Beis HaMikdash, the Flavian dynasty. So he's able to attach the name Flavius to his name Josephus, because he's allied and connected and kind of honorarily part of that family. And he writes a very, very detailed description. He wrote a book called The Wars of the Jews, where he talks about what happened during the time of Churban Bayis. Now, the problem is, of course, that as someone who has a vested interest in the events that took place and is trying to justify his own perfidy as part of his story, it becomes a very difficult question. I had the privilege of studying in college. One of my teachers, Professor Louis Feldman, one of the world experts in Josephus, very fine Jew as well. And I have very clear memories over and over again of sitting with him and him saying, but can we trust Josephus? Right? That's the $1 million question of any detail that he gives. Right? Because again, he has a very personal stake in the game. Right? But over time, much has been borne out. So Josephus writes about Shavas B'Tammuz. So he talks about the fact that on the 7th day of the month of Tammuz, the sacrifice called the daily sacrifice had failed and had not been offered to God. He says something very interesting here. He says, for want of men to offer it. I'm not really sure what that means exactly. That there was no one who was able to bring the Karban Tamid on that day. But he says the people were grievously troubled by it. And it describes how on Shavas B'Tammuz Josephus goes and gives a whole speech, right? He speaks, right? This is something that used to happen during sieges. He gives a drasha, right, to the people, the defenders of the wall of Yerushalayim. He says, basically, you're doomed, right? How you're not giving God his sacrifices anymore, right? He's not going to protect you, which is itself a fascinating echo of the speech that we find in Tanakh by another Jewish turncoat by the name of Rav Shakeh, who during a siege of Yerushalayim, described in the Book of Kings, he goes up and he starts telling them, God's not going to protect you, God's not going to be with you, you've neglected his altars. So there's really it's like the same playbook, right, of Jewish turncoats. We'll come back to, God willing, later in the morning. Right? But I think it's fascinating. He says that Butal HaTamid, the idea that the avoda, that the service of the Beis HaMikdash, right, was interrupted. Right? They weren't able to do it. They couldn't pull it off. They didn't have whatever it was. They couldn't find an animal. That all the Kohanim were engaged in fighting. Right? But they missed a day. Right? And it was traumatic. So there's a Gemara in Zvachim. The Gemara in Zvachim says as follows. It says, "Menayin she'imehekifu ovdei kochavim es kol ha'azara, shekohanim nichnasim l'sham va'ochlin sham kadshi kadshi." So some of the Daf Yomi Chevra did this probably a few weeks ago. The Gemara says, how do you know that if you have a situation where the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash is surrounded by enemies, that the Kohanim are allowed to go into the Heichal, into the building of the Beis HaMikdash, in order to eat the Kadshe Kadshim, to eat the sacrifices they're obligated to eat from. So we need a brief word of background, right? That there are different categories of sacrifices. One are called Kodshe Kodshim. So Kodshe Kodshim, many of the Kodshe Kodshim have a portion that the Kohanim need to eat, right? And normally they eat their karbanos in the azar, right? In the outdoor courtyard. That's where the mizbeach, right? Where the great altar was. That's where the Leviim would sing the songs during the service, right? It was a large outdoor area. And that was the place where Kohanim ate the holiest of the holy sacrifices. The Gemara says, you have this, let's say you had a situation, right, where you can't eat in the azar. Can you go into the building? Into the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, normally, right, this was not a place of access, right? Regular Jews don't go into the Heichal, into the building of the Beis HaMikdash at all. Kohanim are allowed to go in, but only b'shas avodas, right? They're able to go in if they're there to do a job, right? To light the menorah, to offer incense, anything like that. But like, there's no carte blanche to go in, and it's not a restaurant. Right? It's certainly not a place that you go to have a picnic, to eat some, some lamb, some beef, whatever it is that the Kohanim were consuming. So the Gemara says, learns from a pasuk. He says, "V'ochlin sham kodesh kadshe kadashim." You eat there the holy of holies. So you learn from there that one is allowed to do this. So when you have a halach in the Gemara, you never know for sure if it is dealing with a theoretical principle, right, or a real life case. Right? In other words, the Gemara discusses things, right? So, the Gemara discusses, if you use an elephant as a wall of your sukkah, right? So probably it's not because, there is a large movement of building sukkahs out of elephants, but it's to establish the principles. Right? That's certainly very common. But reading Rashi, I think that meant dead seriously. If you're besieged by idolaters, lemilchama, right? This is a wartime situation. And they're firing off, right, arrows into the azara, right, and all kinds of catapulted stones and missiles and artillery is falling into the azara. Rashi says that's what the Gemara is talking about. And to me, it sounds like the Gemara is giving us a snapshot of those last weeks of the Beis HaMikdash, of the Kohanim working literally under fire. And let's play out this situation. Clearly, the Mizbeach, the altar, is outside, right? So they must have been moving very quickly, right? As the arrows and the rockets are coming in, and you think about today, it started up again a little bit. The people who live near Gaza, right, where you hear the siren and you have 15 seconds, right? So you're in the Azara, right, and you have to rush to make sure that the carbon gets offered, it's slaughtered, it's put on the Mizbeach. But certainly to be able to sit and eat from the carbon, right, it's too dangerous. It just literally becomes like the fallout shelter. It's dangerous out there. They're dodging bullets to bring karbanos, right? And they're taking shelter, huddled, and it must have been very scary. Right? It was an awesome thing to go into the Beis HaMikdash. On the one hand, you're running for your life, right? But you're here inside the Beis HaMikdash, and you're eating from the last karbanos that will be offered for 2,000 years, right? It's an amazing scene. It's an amazing scene of dedication on the part of these Kohanim. There's what this was all about. Further, there are categories. And I'm wondering who's bringing those limited karbanos in besieged Yerushalayim. Right, so you have the whole world of the karban chatas, of the sin offering, right, of a person who did a sin inadvertently. In other words, if you do a sin on purpose, a sacrifice is not enough. If you do a sin b'shogeg, you bring a karban chatas. So to me, this is amazing, right? You have a Jew in Yerushalayim. Play this scene out with me, right? And it's the midst of the siege, and the conditions are terrible, and people are starving, right? and you're hiding in your basement, and it's Friday afternoon, and you can't see, there are no windows in the basement, you don't know when Shabbos is starting, and you realize inadvertently that you thought it was still Friday. And so when Shabbos started, you're dealing with whatever cholent you put together, with whatever little bits and pieces of things you're able to scrounge. And you realize afterwards, I did it on Shabbos. It's Machal Shabbos B'Shodi, inadvertently. So this scenario forces us to envision that this Jew somehow, the idea of doing tshuva for this sin was so significant with all of everything else that was going on in Yerushalayim, that somehow they got a hold of an animal, right? And they went through the war-torn streets, and they make their way to the Har HaBayis, and they say, I have to do this. This is what's obligated for me. That I am going to observe these mitzvos even under the most dire circumstance. And notwithstanding what Josephus said, there were Kohanim there waiting to take it. Waiting to say, we're going to be part of your tshuva process. Even if this is going to happen for another 2,000 years. There's another carbon called the Asham Nazir. That a person who at the end of a period of dedicating themselves to God becomes a Nazirite, has to bring a special carbon to atone. Right? A whole discussion what he's atoning for exactly. Really? There were Nazirim in Yerushalayim? Right, in besieged Jerusalem, right? There was nothing better that you could think of it, that there were still Jews, perhaps, right? Whatever these mysterious kodshe, the sacrifices that were being eaten inside the Beis HaMikdash, to me, it's an unbelievable thing, right? And the idea of just trying to imagine the heroism of those Kohanim in those hours. Truth is, I'm sure many of us have read in the past, are going to read later today, literature, memoirs from the Holocaust. So I saw years ago, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach used to tell his family, that's what you should do in the afternoon of Tisha B'Av, is read books from the Holocaust. And when you read these stories about the people, who fasted Yom Kippur in Auschwitz, right? Or found a way to light the menorah on Hanukkah and Bergen-Belsen, it strengthens you. So imagining the Kohanim, right, and their unbelievable self-sacrifice at the end of the time of the Beis HaMikdash adds a certain note of tragic heroism to the story as well. So I want to end with a thought about one last Kohen, right? So you have Josephus, the turncoat Kohen, outside the walls of Yerushalayim, preaching surrender, right? You have the Kohanim inside the embattled city, dodging the arrows and the catapult stones, to be able to eat the karbanos of the Beis HaMikdash. And then you have, perhaps, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So the truth is, it's the debate between Rashi and Tosfos. There's a Rashi in Shabbos that asserts Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Kohen. There's a Tosfos in Menachos that says that he was not a Kohen. But if we stay with Rashi for the moment, the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai left Yerushalayim during the siege. He was smuggled out. It's a whole story, the Gemara in Gittin. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went to the Emperor Vespasian, who was also the sponsor of our friend Josephus. And he said to him, I need you to help me save the Jewish people. And he says to him, Tein li Yavne v'chachamel, give me the little town on the coast of Yavne. And in Yavne, with its cluster of sages, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai rebuilds the Torah and sets up the future of Judaism in exile. So the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, in his deathbed, said that he was terrified. He said, there are two paths in front of me, and I don't know which way they're taking. In other words, to his death, he lived with ambivalence about whether leaving Yerushalayim was the right move or not. Or perhaps the Gemara itself debates why he didn't try to advocate for the Beis HaMikdash. Right? Was this real politic? Did he know he wasn't going to get anywhere asking in that direction? Or as Rabbi Akiva says, this is an instance, right, where God confounded the wisdom of the sages. And that really he messed up. He should have asked at that moment. Perhaps he had the entree to save the Beis Hamikdash. So it seems to me that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai must have also been thinking of the heroism of his brother Kohanim. And the question of, well, again, from the vantage point of 2,000 years, we owe a tremendous debt to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he was able to build. I wonder if part of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wanted to be in the Azara, in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, dodging the arrows and the missiles with his fellow Kohanim, and having the painful, bittersweet privilege of carrying on the Avodah, following the mitzvahs of the Torah, until the very, very last moment. We'll continue with the Kinos of the Kohanim, Eicha Yashva, page 99, in the Rosenfeld, page 174 in the Art Scroll. Eicha Yashva, Eis Kardo Fanayar. So she's looking at the Aviyatsa B'Chevel Samkina, another the Kina Mishmeres Kana, Olara Yitzhak. Yaras and Milpas, Kohen Sefat. Invaran Shigan, Vakalel from Milfiki. Nabi Mama, Shmers. Mishkalawa and Khaki. Also like you, Shmers. Hearing us, Raf Mefafeinu, Kikedem Tariach, Shulchan Charav, Shlei Chalasariach. Okay, the next Kina Eiko, which is on page 109 in the Rosenfeld, 192 in the art scroll. So the structure of Eiko turns on something of a play on words. The word Eicha, how or alas, which is, we find again and again in the book of Eicha that we read last night, can be divided also into two words, Eiko. Where is Ko? And so the word Ko means so shall be, and is a phrase that a word that occurs many, many times in the course of Tanakh, generally introducing a prophecy from God. Ho amar Hashem, so Hashem says. So this Kina essentially references various usages of the word Ko that we find in the Torah, that we find in Navi, with the idea of where are the promises? Right? In other words, where are all of the statements that were given to Klal Yisrael by their Nevi'im that said, Ko is, this is the way that it is going to be. And where are they? Right? In other words, where are the, right? In other words, that God said, Kodi Zaracha, so your descendants are going to be. Right? So where are these promises? Right? Where are they being fulfilled? The promises that were given to us. And there is a tremendous sense of panic, right? Leading into this Kina. And the idea that these things that we assume that we took for granted or our security, right, are something disappearing. Almost as the sense, I don't know if this has happened to you or maybe to the somebody ahead of you in line. Somebody's standing in a store and they pay with a credit card and something's wrong and the credit card is rejected. Right? And they pull out another credit card. That one's also rejected. And they're emptying their wallet of all of their, their backups and their guarantees, and none of them are working. And that very much was part of the Churban experience. Was the sense like that this can't be happening. So go back, we talked about Yirmiyahu a little bit. Yirmiyahu chastises the Jewish people. In the 7th chapter of Yirmiyahu, that they assume that the Beis Hamikdash cannot be destroyed. Right? That there is a warranty, as it were, on this building that represents God's presence with the Jewish people. And this is forever, right? It's not going away. And Yirmiyahu says it's not correct, you're wrong. Right? The Beis Hamikdash is going to be destroyed. He says, Al tiftachu lachem el divrei hasheker lemor, heichel Hashem, heichel Hashem, heichel Hashem heima. He says, don't listen to those false words. Right? And the people promise you this is God's temple. God is not going to destroy his own temple. He says, it's not going to be. Right? I'm telling you the Beis Hamikdash is going to be destroyed. So I think it's fascinating to know. Right? Some of you were in Shul yesterday, we talked about the fact that on some level in Bayis Sheni, it was different. Right? Particularly the people who saw the destruction themselves. They knew firsthand they're going to be destroyed. But it's interesting, I saw a reference, there was a Jew in the century before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, a Jew in Alexandria in Egypt. His name was Philo. So Philo was a proud Jew, he was a philosopher, he was very involved in the Greek civilization that existed in Egypt at his time. And Philo wrote many, many books where he tries to present the Torah to his fellow Egyptian, Hellenistic, Jewish audience. Right? And very much he was a booster that people should keep mitzvahs and so forth. There's a whole debate among historians whether Philo could read Hebrew or not, or if he only knew the Torah through the Greek translation. Right? Again, Art Scroll 2,000 years earlier. And Philo writes that the Beis HaMikdash will never be destroyed. How he came to that conclusion, I don't really know. But there was this notion that the Beis HaMikdash was too big to fail. By the way, I will point out parenthetically that Philo had a nephew who became a general in the Roman army, and Philo's nephew was the second in command of the Roman army that destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. Right? Families are funny things. Some of you might remember September 11th. And one of the things that I feel like I have a really hard time communicating to my kids was how shocking that day was. It was the idea that terrorists could strike America, could strike at the Pentagon, at the World Trade Center, that these things, in our minds, they were impregnable, right? So, for the kids growing up in the post 9/11 world, they know it happened, right? And God forbid if something like that would ever happen again, right? Certainly it will be shocking, but it won't be surprising. Once you know that it can happen. But this is like the immediate shock afterwards. How could this be happening? Didn't God promise us? And of course, the frightening piece of this is if God made all these promises and they all now seem to be broken, all these covenants, right? There's all these different statements that God promised that this is what's going to happen to the Jewish people. Eiko kichas leviim shleimecha, right? Where is the promise that was given to the Levium when you chose them? Right? That's the counterpart to what we just said. How can it be? You promised the Kohanim right there are going to be serving you forever. And now there's no Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim have nothing to do. So where's the promise? So Gemara Pesachim. The Gemara Pesachim says, why was it that the first exile took place in the Babylon? Why of all places? Right? The Jews could have wound up. It could have been, it's interesting, the geopolitics at the time. Right? It was Egypt versus Babel. If you read the Nevi'im at the time, especially Yirmiyahu and Chazkel, you see the tremendous tension of this war between Egypt and Babel. So God could have arranged it, right? We could have gone to Egypt, right? The Egyptians were the ones who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, right? Or anybody. Whoever got, if God wanted, a bunch of people from India to show up and destroy the Beis HaMikdash. Verse is why. Rabbi Yochanan says, Moshel Adam Shekaras Al Ishto. Says, imagine you have a couple that have a terrible fight. Terrible fight. And they break up. Leicha Mishagra. So where is the woman sent back to? Face Ima. She goes back to her mother's house. Right? If things are really, really bad, the family's falling apart, right? When the marriage dissolves, she goes back to her mother's house. So Rashi says, Face Ima. Avraham, the Urkas Kastim Yatz. That Avraham came from Bavel. He came from Ur Kasdim. And so it makes sense that if there is a dramatic fight between God and the Jewish people, and if God has rejected the Jewish people, then they go home. Going home means it's like none of this stuff ever happened. It's like God never made any of these promises to Avraham and to Yitzchak and to Yaakov. But we're back where we started, right? Back in the land of Babylonia, where Avram's great journey began. We're in Sanhedrin. Definitely. Shmuel says, Ba'u asar b'nei adam v'yeshvu l'fanav. Says 10 people came and sat down before the prophet. Right? This is probably a description of the prophet Yecheskel, who was the spiritual leader of the Jews in the Babylonian exile. So Yechezkel is sitting, and a bunch of the leaders of the Jewish people, as is described in the Sefer a number of times, come to see. And they said, and it tells them, Chazar b'tshuva, what you expect to hear from your prophet, do tshuva. So they say to him, Rebbe, Isha shegar shabayla, klum yesh l'zel zek klum. He said, if a couple gets divorced, man divorces his wife, is there any subsequent relationship? Right? Once they were married, once they were running a household, once they were raising children together, right? Once they had a shared life and a shared mission, and they took care of each other. But there's something called divorce. And when the divorce is final, the connection is severed. So Rebbe, you're telling us to do tshuva, but we've been rejected. Eiko, where are all the promises? It's done. It's done. It's probably our fault, but it's done. God tells the Navi, Leichem Orlahen, tell them, Eize Sefer Krisus Imcha Asher Shlachti. Show me the get. Right? In our Kino, we say Eiko, we ask God where all the promises are. But God says, where's the get? Right? I have not divorced you. Certainly it feels that way. Right? It feels like the sense of rejection. But at the end of the day, the bond is still there, it's not over. And that really is the very beginning of Eichel. Haisa Kalman. The Jewish people was like a widow. As I'll say, Ki Almana, they were like a widow. It doesn't say Haisa Almana, that they were a widow. That's how they felt. So that feeling of rejection is very real, right? And it's very serious. And that sense of that horrible feeling of being back above it made it feel like all the promises are gone. I'll tell you the truth. You know, it's a little bit easier for us today to be able to focus back on these prophecies of all the commitments and guarantees that God made to the Jewish people. Because we live in a time where we've seen it fulfilled. Like the fact that we live in a reality that essentially we're bound where most of Klal Yisrael lives in Eretz Yisrael, and then we're not dominated by foreigners, and then we can defend ourselves, and then we can go wherever we want in Eretz Yisrael, then we can go to the Kotel, we can go to all the Kivrei Tzadikim, right? And you can go to all of the unbelievable resurgence of Jewish life, all of Eretz Yisrael, that our ancestors would have wept with joy to see 1% of what we've seen, right? It's perhaps not as burning as it once was, but at the same time, the question of, do we really even believe in the commitments that we will stand one day to Beis HaMikdash again, that there will be a time of redemption, that there will be Mashiach, that there will be universal peace, right? Or do we also ask ourselves, Eiko? So I want to share with you one last thing that I came across that I thought really was quite striking. You know, there is a custom that existed with different variations in different Sephardic and Yemenite and Italian communities to announce the year of the exile, right? That on Tisha B'Av, or there's someone to it, the Chassam Sofer used to do this during his, he used to give a drasha every year in Pressburg, 2 days before Tisha B'Av. Right, to try to get people in the mood. And every year he would say, this year it's so and so many years the destruction of Beis HaMikdash. Right? And the Italian men, they would do this to Shabbat night. They would announce in shul before Eicha, this is so and so many years of the destruction of Beis HaMikdash. So I came across a sefer from the 18th century called Yesh Makrilin, written by Pinchas Ketzenel and Bogan, member of a very prominent Ashkenazi family of rabbis and teachers. And he says something really interesting. He talks about this practice of the years of the Churban. He says, "V'ani l'dati choshesh lomar kach." He says, I'm nervous to quote the year. Why? He says, "Rak hamuchzak be'enai lirei Hashem." He says, I only talk about how long it's been since the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, right? The idea that we are now, right, 1948 years. It's a funny year to think about, right? Because I'll say that it was the Jewish year 1948 when Avraham Avinu discovered God, right? And certainly in the secular years, also a pregnant number. Yadati sheyesh kalei adas she'enan ma'aminim b'bias HaMashiach v'rechmana litzlan. I know there are people who don't really believe in the coming of Mashiach. He says, I'm worried about that. If I tell them the truth, that in this year, Tov Kuf Tezayin is 1757, 56. They were holding already 1688 years in the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. He says, they're just going to give up. Right? Because if we talk about this, how long it's been, he says this is counterproductive. Right? We don't want this information being out there for people to know. So when we say a code, right, where are the promises? On the one hand, one of the things we have to challenge ourselves with is that are we responding to the fact that we do believe that Ayeh Sefer, Krisos Imchem, that we have no get separating us from God, that these promises are going to take place? Do we continue, for notwithstanding everything that we've seen and how many years that it's been, do we continue to believe that redemption is possible? We continue with Eiko, page 109, in the Rosenfeld 192 notes. Eiko. Eiko Shivas Shofaros Eret. Kosas Esheishis Yamim Le'avuchom. Atashem Tov Eret. Sorry. Eiko Teshuvah. Masaya Elohim. Charif Tzara. Okay, the next kina, the next kina is Chashar Satsar Befinim, takes us into the desecration of the Beis Hamikdash prior to its destruction. And the scene that we have is the Tsar, the enemy, the very beginning of the keynote, to the reference to Titus Harasha, to the Roman general, and later Emperor Titus. So the keynote describes him striding into the Beis Hamikdash itself. And it's striking the imagery that we have of him kind of striding in with his shoes on. The sixth paragraph, Nashim kasharu kiva aritz, that women stared at the approaching tyrant. The karka habayitz na'alav hecharitz, that in the floor of the temple, that his shoes scratched. So I always find it interesting. This translation, many of the other translations, use the word boots for na'alav. The image, for whatever reason, they use. I'm not really sure it's there. But certainly to us, the resonance of the enemy marching in their boots is very powerful. The idea that he comes into the Beis Hamikdash, a place you're not allowed to walk into first of all, that only Kohanim can go into the Beis Hamikdash, only the Kohen Gadol can go to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So here you have this enemy non-Jewish general who's going in. He's going in his boots. He's scratching the floor. Right. So the way it describes it again, it is too terrible almost to say that he runs in with his sword. He slashes the curtain of the parochas that separates between the Kodesh HaKadoshim and the outside. The verse says that the parochas bled when he stabbed him. And it describes that finally he comes in and he brings a harlot with him into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And there, going back to the Gemara, it describes Tidus rolls out a Sefer Torah on the floor and there profanes the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And it's interesting that this hatred, not just for the Jews, but for the Jewish religion and what it represented, right, is a theme that repeats itself in the story of the Churban. In fact, Josephus writes that when they finally had the victory parade in Rome, the last thing, they brought thousands of slaves with them. It was terrible, a terrible, terrible kind of business. The last thing they brought in the parade was a Sefer Torah, right? Because we have defeated the Jews and their religion. And it talks about all the different things that he takes the parochas, he uses it to gather up all of the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash, right? Makes a big sack out of the parochas. So it might have been that there was a time where modern, sophisticated people would feel that this sounds invented. Right? All right, in other words, certainly there's a war, atrocities happen at war, but the idea that there is this kind of unrelenting, brutal, nasty, vicious hatred of the Jewish religion, that comes from our own self-obsession. There's like, nobody else cares as much as we do. Right? So we kind of have projected this kind of desecration. So I think this is one of the areas that living in an era after the Holocaust makes us realize that these things really happened. And if they really happened 70 years ago, that it validates the literal truth of this midrashic tradition that our Kina is based on. So we're going to come back to the Holocaust a little bit later on. But I want to share with you something I literally just saw from a book by an Italian Jew by the name of Primo Levi. Primo Levi was a chemist. He was a writer. He was deported from Italy to Auschwitz. And he wrote a number of significant books. So right after the war, he wrote a book called Auschwitz Report. He was waiting to return home in 1945, right? And that the Russian authorities asked him to write about what was going on in Auschwitz. It was never translated into English until very, very recently. And it is a fascinating document because it is a testimony that was literally within months of liberation. It was not someone looking back 40 years, 50 years. The memory is much more long. So I want to share with you one passage that he writes about his arrival in the work camp outside of Auschwitz. The winter outfit of the Monowitz prisoners consisted of a jacket, a pair of trousers, and an overcoat of woolen cloth and plus a shirt, a pair of cotton underpants, and a pair of boots with wooden soles. That was the winter clothing. He says having spare underwear was strictly forbidden, so it was practically impossible to wash underwear. These items were officially changed in intervals of 30, 40, or 50 days, depending on availability and without the possibility of choice. The new underwear was not actually clean, of course, but simply disinfected by steam once a month once every 50 days, because there was no laundry in the camp. It usually consisted of short cotton underpants and of shirts, always of a disgusting appearance, because of the many stains of all kinds and often reduced to rags. Sometimes instead one would be given the jacket or trousers from a pair of pajamas, or even some article of female underwear. The repeated disinfections weakened the fibers of the cloth, removing all resistance to wear and tear. Many of the foot cloths and the underwear had obviously been made out of talesi, the sacred shawls with which Jews cover themselves during prayers, retrieved from the luggage of some of the deportees and made use of in this way as a mark of contempt. It boggles the mind that this was an efficient system to use. And the idea, a tiny, tiny piece of horror and devastation, but of the continuity between Titus HaRasha at the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and of the Nazis in the work camp in 1944, looking to go out of their way for Chil HaKodesh, to desecrate that which is most holy, I think is something which resonates to this very day. We'll continue with the Kinos of Sa'ad Sarafidin, page 111 in the Rosenfeld, 220 in the Arts Room. Says, lots of Tisha, enough love. Tisha. Okay, the next Kina Imtachalna is perhaps the most grisly and difficult of all of the Kinos. This is the Kina that references the cannibalism that took place during the times of the destruction of the first and second temple. That in the tremendous hunger, starvation, famine that stalked the city, the people literally driven mad with hunger, forced to cannibalism and even to eat their own children. Imagery, which again is very difficult. Women eating their own fruit, their coddled babies. If the compassionate cook their own children. So I want to share with you first a description. Thinking about the hunger in Yerushalayim, it was a short op-ed piece written by Rachel Sharansky Danziger, who was the daughter of Natan Sharansky, who wrote an article for Asar B'Teves this past year. So she says, as a child, she never figured out how to connect to Asar B'Teves. So she felt very, very strongly that Tisha B'Av, she said, when we come to shul, hearing the words of Eicha would claw at her flesh. Since the 17th of Tammuz commemorated the breaching of Jerusalem's walls, evoked terrible images. Even as a child, I shuddered to think of the burning homes and the battles in the streets, the summer light glinting on red swords, and the wails of the bereaved and the wounded. And he said, Asar B'Teves is the beginning of the siege. And I was like, I couldn't get into it. Bloody swords and the burning ruins were all in the future. She said, as a mother, I think of that day and the still whole Jerusalem of Asar B'Teves and shiver. I think of that day and I see a woman. She holds her infant in her arms and knows this child's days are numbered. The food supplies will run out. The milk will stop flowing. She holds a child in her arms and the child is alive. The death and ever-present promise is in her arms as well. Beside this woman, her oldest son is playing with a wooden sword. She smiles at him, and she knows sooner or later he will need to wield a metal blade. Will his arms be strong enough? Or will one of the swords gleaming beyond the wall be the one to take his life? Her daughter is there too, a maiden to be. The woman pats her hair and knows her daughter won't bloom into a well-fed, healthy woman. And if the walls fall, who will hold her daughter then? So this Kinos reminds us about the human toll, right? About the human suffering that was involved, of course, first and foremost in the Korban. And really, of all of the suffering that individual Jews lived over Jewish history, we'll come back a little bit to that theme of the individuals. We talk about numbers, we talk about destruction of communities and institutions. But at the end of the day, this is also about the profound suffering of Jewish families no different than our own as well. So we throw around the word hunger, right? Starving generally means that like maybe we missed lunch, right? Or maybe didn't have coffee in the afternoon. Right? But starving is something very real and very terrible. Right? Starving is something that robs us of our humanity. So I want to show you a story that I think I actually referenced last year as well. But I think that it bears repeating. So one of the rabbis of Poland, a few rabbis of Poland to survive the war, was a Jew by the name of Rabbi Yeshua Moshe Aronson. He was a Talmud, he learned in Brisk and Sachachav. It's very close to the Sachachav Rebbe. And he came out, and thank God, in 1951, he comes to Eretz Yisrael. He becomes the Rav in Petach Tikva, and he actually becomes responsible for the Rabbanut for taking Truma and Maser. Right? He was in charge of the agricultural laws in Eretz Yisrael, which developed an expertise of this Jew who spent his time in the worst conditions in concentration camps. Right? And he wrote afterwards memoirs. So this is what he writes. He says, at the beginning of the month of Iyar in 1945, and the Jews are being marched, he says, marched on a death march from Buchenwald. So some of you may be aware that in the last months of the war, things were very confused, but there were directives given in a number of the concentration camps to try to finish up their dastardly work before liberation would come. So some of that involved, there are certain camps where they just gunned down people. Right? There are camps where they eradicated any of the evidence. And there are also places where they would march Jews from one place to another under terrible, terrible conditions, without food, without water, horrible, horrible stories that come out from these death marches. So he describes this. They're on this march. He says every day they were very, very, very hungry. He says to the point that they would try to eat the grass that grew on the sides of the road. He said that the local Germans in the area would come up and yell at them that we need the grass for our animals. You can't, this is our grass. So Ray Aronson says that he was approached by a friend of his on this death march. And he says, I thought maybe some of us, we could stay alive. People were literally like dropping at the sides of the road. He says, you know, like, we know liberation is coming. And if we can just make it a few more days, that's all we need. He says, what do you think, Rabbi? Maybe, is it mutter that we should eat from the dead bodies of the people who fall? So he says, at that moment, I start crying, and I said, Rabbi Shalom, kill me rather than bring me to such a low madrega. So he told him the following. He says, I think you're right, halachically, that it's permitted, and perhaps there's even a mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. And he says, but he says, we really found these, and remembers in the Midrashim about the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. I want to pause here for a second. So I always, when I read about these things in the Kinos about eating the children, I assumed that these were people like desperate, half-mad. It never occurred to me that there was a shiloh. Right? It never occurred to me that these people might have gone to find a dayan, a chacham, and said, what are we supposed to do here? What is our option, right? Knowing how dire our circumstances, right? And then maybe really you can make a case that al pi din, that according to halacha, that this really is, in fact, the proper thing to do. Or that this is exactly what we need to be doing. So he says that maybe you can even bring that as a raya, bring that as a halachic proof, that this is, in fact, exactly what we need to do. He said it's not possible. I don't believe it. I cannot accept that that is indeed the case, that it would be, that we should do this. He says for two reasons. Number one, he says, I'm afraid that I'm scared that once we start doing this, we will wind up in a situation, right, where people are literally killing each other. This can't be. It's one thing to say, right, that to scavenge, right, but the idea that really we could permit this, it's going to lead to murder, God forbid. But he said, I have another concern. He says, we are surrounded, right, by the soldiers of the SS. And he says, how can it be that we can give them the opening to say, look at what animals, what barbarians these Jews are. He says, it can't be that we would allow such a thing to happen. And he says that he heard this. And he says an hour later, literally, they got the order and they were liberated. It's very hard for us to imagine what starvation is. I think it's part of what we're trying to picture as you read through this. I feel like this is one of the Kinos that you have to read through in English to really appreciate, imagine what it's like the way that Rachel Sharansky-Danziger pictured it. Right? What it's like, and particularly those of us who are parents or grandparents, to try to imagine what a horrible, horrible thing is being described here. Continue with the Kinos, page 234 in the Art Scroll, 120 in the Roosevelt. V'rach HaKodesh, L'modon Marim, Hoyal Kol Shem, B'asher L'kram Odim, Es Asher Asu L'modim, Im Tocham Nashim Piryam Mashmiim, Im Yored B'mikdash Adonai, Kohen V'Navi, Lo Mashmiim. Okay, the next Kinos Tzedakah, which is on page 123, the Roosevelt 242 in the Art Scroll, is challenging in a very different kind of way. This is the Kina of Tziduk Hadin, of justifying God's judgment. So we have a general assumption that part of our emunah, part of our faith, is to say that God's judgments are correct. This is encapsulated in the Jewish view of tragedy, of Dain HaEmes, God forbid, in the moment of profound loss, right, that we say God is the true judge, and that this is actually part of the process of a funeral, right, is the recitation of Tziduk Hadin, right, saying that we accept that this death is the result of God's judgment. So that certainly is challenging emotionally. This, though, takes it a step forward and points out the idea, not just that God is. If someone says that a tragedy happened because of something that somebody else did, that's problematic. We are not prophets. Right? We don't have that kind of insight. And if you hear people saying that, I think that it's very difficult to say. This is put in first person plural. Yours is the justice, right? Yours is the right, and ours is the shame for our sins. So particularly in a world, we have the books of the Nevi'im that tell us where God communicated directly through his prophets about the sins of the Jewish people. So I want to share with you a very interesting Meshech Chochmah. It's Meshech Chochmah in Parshas Beshalach. And Meshech Chochmah says there is a difference between the way that God judges different sins. And there's what he sees as most significant. Right, so we have a listing of mitzvahs that we find in the Torah. Right, many of them are punishable if there's a Jewish court. Avodah zarah, right, idolatry, arayos, sexual immorality. And those are considered very, very significant mitzvahs in the Torah. Mitzvahs that are so important that one is obligated to martyr oneself rather than succumb to these sins. But he says something very interesting. He says, the way that God judges society are for other sins. He says, machlokas, lashon hara, chilus, gezel, for controversy, for fighting, for lashon hara and gossip and theft. He says, even though for many of these sins, they're not really actionable in Bezdin. Right? A court has no jurisdiction. You spoke lashon hara, so we're going to whip you. It doesn't exist. Right? They don't have those kinds of punishments. He says, however, that on a communal level, these are the things that God sees as dissolving society. That when you have a society that has those kinds of sins within that, it falls apart. So he quotes Yerushalmi. He says, the Yerushalmi says, the generation of David HaMelech were tzaddikim. But even though that was the case, because there was a lot of inter-fighting between them, right, that God did not always bring them success in war. He says, however, the generation of Achav, the king of Israel, who were notorious idolaters, the Yerushalmi says, everybody got along. Right? They would go to war and be successful. Right? And then those are the things that Mishloach Baruch Hu really judges them on. And he says, it's interesting that he says, the Jews, when they succumbed to the sin of the golden calf, right, they had experience with idolatry in Egypt. He says, but the sin of the spies, which at the end of the day, right, had a much more direct punishment. He says, that's the sin of Lashon Hara. The Medrash says in Egypt, the Jews were able to, in such a way that they had a society without Lashon Hara, about Eretz Yisrael, about our possibilities of success. He says those are the kinds of things that Mishloach Baruch Hu will not tolerate. So I think this shows us the complexity, right, of God's judgment and how it works. And to remind ourselves in this Kinos, that on the one hand, that this is a day of introspection, trying to understand what are our faults as individuals, as groups. But again, at the end of the day, this is an eternal work. Right? This is about finding fault within ourselves, right? Not finding fault within others. We'll start with Chashem Hatzedakah on page 123 in the Rosenfeld 242 notes.
stop it. I think it'll work better than this one. Facebook is not downloading this one. I keep doing it. That's the YouTube working. It's YouTube working. That's good for YouTube. I should get the same on. YouTube is on. YouTube is the one that's on the laptop. It just keeps going out. Might be the internet.
Okay, the next kina is Arze Halvanon. Arze Halvanon is one of the many piyutim that has been written, both for Tisha B'Av, for Yom Kippur, for other settings as well, based on the midrashim of the Asar Harugim Malchus, of the 10 martyrs. So the structure of the medrash talks about the idea that there were, during the time following the destruction of the Second Temple, that there were 10 great sages who were executed by the Romans in a series of awful, gruesome kinds of death. And that we invoke their memories in a variety of different circumstances. And Yom Kippur, we invoke them as part of a plea for kapara, for atonement from God. And on Tisha B'Av, it is part of our mourning. So we are remembering the loss of all of these really great individuals throughout the history of Klal Yisrael. So there's a medrash in the Medrash Tehillim that says as follows. Pasuk, we say it in Avarachamim all the time. Pasuk says, "V'lo shachach tza'akas hanavim." God does not forget the cries of the humble. It says, "Eino shocheach daman shel Yisrael." That God does not forget the blood of Israel. Miyad umos ha'olam, from the hand of the nations of the world. V'lo daman shel tzadikim bilvad, ela kol mi shenerag b'mei hashma. He says God is going to remember, and He's going to that God is going to requite the blood of all Jews who were killed because they were Jewish. Right? Every single one, not just the tzaddikim, it's not just Asari Harugim Malchus, it's not only the 10 people who we are remembering from thousands of years ago, but the idea is that any Jew who's ever killed Al Kiddush Hashem, right, that God is going to remember. That is part of the promise that we are made. So the Medrash makes this image very powerful. Rabbi Vo b'shem Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Vo says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Kol tzadik v'tzadik sheklos ha'olam harginoso, that any righteous person that the nations of the world killed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu kosvo v'purpuria shelo, that God writes down their names on His robe. right? That again, in a very anthropomorphic image, that God has a robe covered with the names of Jewish martyrs. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Omer L'Bnos HaOlam, Lama Haragtem HaTzadikim Shem. That God will say, why have you killed my righteous? Kigon of Chanani ben Trajan, like Chanani ben Trajan, one of the sages on the list that we're going to read about, that we all remember the details of it, said 2,000 years later. He says, V'chol Ergin al Kiddush Shemi, and anyone who is killed to sanctify my name. Right? It's like the beginning of the Medrash. The robe has every name on it. And that God will eventually execute judgment for all the people who were killed in his name. Right? At the time of the Khurban, in the time of the Crusades, in Spain, in the Ukraine and in Poland during the Holocaust, every family that was ripped apart by terrorists. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to remember every single one of them, is going to bring justice for each one of them. Now this notion of nekama, the notion of forgiveness, is a very challenging one. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is revenge something that we're really looking for? Right? Is revenge something that we want? On some level, it becomes more abstract for us. So there's like, what does it mean to have revenge for something that happened 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago? Who are we getting the revenge from exactly? Is revenge the same thing as justice? Right? So we say, Kel Nekamos Hashem. God is an avenging God. So God perhaps can be avenging, but it's much more complicated for us. There is a fascinating shmooze by Rav Chaskel Levenstein. So Rav Chaskel, it's written down in his collection of drashos, the Or Yechezkel, was very bothered by the reaction in Israel to the Eichmann trial. And he says, "V'nishmoim b'tzibur dvarim ki zachilu lasos nekama b'rotzech v'nach shmo v'kel nekamos Hashem." And you hear things, right? People are saying, "Look, what we're able to do, right? That we can take revenge on this horrible murderer, and God is an avenging God." And he says that these are rechokim mikol havanos haTorah. He says that this is very far from the Torah. He says, we're not really profoundly bothered by the loss of human life. And he says there was an earthquake that took place recently where thousands of people were killed. And you don't see Jews walking around, right, feeling pain. What's going to be Nebuch? Look at all this loss of human life. Right? So all this is, he says, this is not what Kel Nekamos Hashem means. He says, He's like, he says, what do you think? Somehow bring back all the people who were killed, right? Because you're going to get whatever it is, your vengeance against Eichmann, right? Punishment, sure. Justice, absolutely. But the idea that, like, you have this need that needs to be fulfilled. He says, he says, this is that we have a certain lust for victory, right? We were harmed, and we want to, get our punches in also. He says, that's not Nekam. He says that this is something which is perhaps having that kind of a mentality of revenge, right, is actually very destructive. So again, my goal here is not to comprehensively discuss the topic of Nekama today. It's a very complicated issue, but I think that this perspective is significant to our discussion. We talk about, on the one hand, we affirm the idea that the names of all the Kedoshim are in front of God, right? But on the other hand, talking about vengeance, it's a double-edged sword, and it has consequences. This way of talking. So I'd like to reframe this for a moment, to try to understand an image in the Medrash of the robe with the Asar Malchus, the names of all the other martyrs written on it. And it's a Medrash which is quoted in the Chizkiah. Some of you might remember that the Torah describes that somewhere around the time of the giving of the Torah, it's described in the 24th chapter of Shmos, that the Jewish people, or part of the Jewish people, were shown a vision. Right? It says, "Vayiru es Elokei Yisrael," they saw the God of Israel. V'sachas raglov k'masei livnas hasakir. They saw a vision of the God of Israel, whatever exactly that means, and under his feet was a sapphire block. So the Chizkiah quotes the Medrash as follows. It says, we know that at the very worst part of the slavery, that the Jews were compelled and beaten, right, to make bricks, and they weren't given straw. They had to find their own straw. Right? So the straw they found out in the wilderness, it wasn't, the kind of straw that you get at Home Depot, right? It was all like filled with all kinds of thorns and brambles and things of that sort. And it says that this wood, they would, with their feet, they would grind the straw with the mud to make the bricks. It would lacerate their feet, right? So the bricks in Egypt, those last bricks that were made, right? The last bricks that were made in Mitzrayim, right, was filled with the blood of the Jews. Their own blood was going into the bricks. He says that there was a young woman by the name of Rachel, who was pregnant. She was expecting. She and her husband are working together in the mud pits. And the Medrash says that in the midst of all of this work going back and forth, she gave birth in the mud pit, right? And the baby comes out and dies in the mud. She's screaming for her son. Also, and her screams go up before the throne of glory. V'yarad Michael taluhu ve'elu. He says, Michael, the angel, goes down and takes this brick, kneaded with Jewish blood, and with Nebuch, this little baby in the brick, and puts it in front of God, that this should be God's footstool. And he says that this is the Livnas HaSapir, the brick that they saw. It was the brick in front of God of the brick with the infant inside. That's the Chizkiah. So it must have been, for our ancestors who came out of Mitzrayim and received the Torah, they must have had tremendous questions. Right? Of all of the people who died during slavery, who were lost, the graves left behind in Egypt, and for all of the nisim and niflos, the miracles and wonders they saw, right? They must have still had so many questions why all these people had to suffer. So the vision that they saw at Ma'amad Har Sinai didn't answer their questions, but it told them that perhaps the most aching piece of this kind of suffering, the idea that when we suffer, that it's for naught, right? That the victims just disappear, right? The vision that the brick is there in front of God, which is really what the Medrash means, that God's robe is covered with the names of the Kedoshim, is that we are given a guarantee that God has not forgotten, that their suffering was not for nothing. I heard, it's actually literally this morning, I was putting my last notes together. So I was listening in the background to a recording of a Kinos presentation, I think from last year by Moshe Weinberger. And he talked about a trip that he took with his shul, Eish Kodesh in Woodmere, to Poland a year and a half ago, to go to visit both the graves of the tzaddikim who were buried there, and also to go to the concentration camps as well. I think I actually mentioned yesterday that he himself, his grandparents, were killed in Auschwitz. And he said one of the things that, he found most horrifying was the fact that there are no graves. Right? The idea that you go, that there's a certain nachama. When you go to a cemetery to go to the graves of parents, of grandparents, of relatives, right? The idea that the matzeva, that the tombstone, right, is a way of perpetuating their life, right? That even though they're gone to us, somehow this is a place, there's something there, there's something physical, there's something permanent that helps you remember. That is something which moderates, it sweetens a little bit the grief. And so in recent Jewish history, there are so many Kedoshim that have no graves, that nobody remembers them. Whole families that were wiped out, it's as if they don't exist. So the real Nakama, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does in the end is his business. But for us, to know that it's not in vain, to be able to say that their names are on God's robe, that their memory is in a brick in front of him, that I think is the most significant thing for us in terms of talking about the idea of it. So I want to give you one last story. There was, in 1997, there's a rabbi from the New York area named Ronald Greenwald. He was a special person who was involved in all kinds of different things, Leman Akal, for the Jewish community. So Rabbi Greenwald had a lot of political connections, made a negotiation with the Lithuanian government to recover Sifrei Torah that had survived in Lithuania and to bury the ones that were too damaged. He says so they stopped, he was a Talmud of Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland. So he wanted to go back to see, right, what was left from Telz. He said, so they came, he gave a hesped for the students who died Kiddush Hashem in Telz, who never had a proper eulogy. And I would add, by the way, parenthetically, I remember I was going to check out and confirm the details, but I have a cousin in Chicago whose sons were all Talmidim at Telz Chicago. So he told me that they have a practice in Telz Chicago that normally in most yeshivas, the Zman, the semester that begins leading up to Rosh Hashanah, what's called El Zman, begins Rosh Chodesh Elul. That's the day that yeshivas kind of are up and running again. So in Telz, they start, if I recall correctly, 10 days early, on the day that Telz in Lithuania was destroyed. And they have a whole tefillah that begins this man, they come in, they have slichos that they say, it's a very powerful, moving kind of thing, right? They reiterate the continuity, which exists in America, with what happened in Europe. He says that when Rabbi Greenwald came to the partially destroyed building, frozen in time like it was the same day. So he found a bunch of Sifrei Torah that had been burnt. Again, a favorite activity of the Nazis. He opens up and he's looking at all these very burnt Sifrei Torah, and he finds one tiny little piece that's left. So he picks it up, right? And of all of the pieces of parchment that he found, he finds a plus. Hashem said to Moshe, saying, avenge the vengeance of the Jewish history, the Torah, to go out and fight and take revenge when directed directly by God. Revenge that a Talmud of Telz Cleveland comes back to Telz Lithuania and is able to stand there, right, and give a hesped for the students who perished as a proud Jew living in America. That itself is an account, the idea that they didn't die for nothing. Right? That we continue to perpetuate them just as on a much more ultimate level, that their names continue to be written on the robe of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shamayim. Arzal Vanon, page 125 in the Rosenfeld 259. Just look up.
I'll be fine. It is working.
And that's Israel. Play Yaakov, Shlitas, and Yisacham, Yazar. Shema,